A generation after apartheid, the Stellenbosch region is gripped by a struggle that pits white citizens who still control much of the economy against their black neighbors. Stellenbosch, South Africa. One cold morning, Stefan Smit, a white farmer in South Africa's stunning wine region, woke up to find his vineyard under siege. Anxious and angry, Mr. Smit, 62, drove his pickup truck to the highest point on his estate and peered down. Impoverished residents from the black township next door had stormed the land, clearing weeds and erecting 40 shacks in a matter of hours. "I, personally, can't breathe here," Mr. Smit said later. Virtually overnight, Mr. Smit's farm, with its sweeping views of the Stellenbosch region, became a battleground in a bitter political fight that has split the nation and reached all the way to the Trump White House. Who should own South Africa's land? The fight pits white South Africans, who still control much of the economy a generation after the end of apartheid, directly against their black neighbors, many of whom are struggling to acquire a tiny patch on which to build a shack. A recent government survey found that white farmers like Mr. Smit control nearly 70% of farms held by individual owners in South Africa. And the figure does not even include land held by companies and trusts, which account for the largest share of privately owned land in the country. In this fabled corner of South Africa, where Americans and other foreigners come to taste Chenin Blanc and Pinotage, white farmers like Mr. Smit have been trying to hold on to a part of the country they consider their historic domain. He and his white Afrikaner friends call it an invasion, part of a calculated effort by the governing African National Congress to capture the only province that remains out of its political control. "People are being brought from other parts of the country just to create a voting bloc," said Jan de Klerk, a friend of Mr. Smit's and a son of F.W. de Klerk, the former president who negotiated the end of apartheid with Nelson Mandela. "It's not skills coming into the town. It's basically just people coming in, and there's no room. The squatters say they moved in out of desperation." Life had barely changed for the men and women in the neighboring township, even a quarter-century after achieving democracy. They still lived in flimsy shacks in cramped quarters, while Mr. Smit and his friends hold vast tracts of land brutally snatched from African inhabitants generations ago and deliberately kept in white hands for decades to come. The monopolies go far beyond private estates. Nearly 80 of the farms in Stellenbosch sit on public land. And most of them are locked in 50-year leases that local authorities signed with white farmers in the early 1990s, right before the end of apartheid, in exchange for private investments in water infrastructure, according to confidential municipal audits obtained by the New York Times. The arrangements have enabled the farmers to maintain control of large stretches of public land long after the arrival of democracy. "We see that land, we must take that land," said Zola Nd Lassie, 44, the man who led the takeover, as he walked among the new shacks. Because he came from the same region as Mr. Mandela, everyone called him by the same clan name, Madiba. With only a few months to go before elections, this elemental struggle, over who owns South Africa, is playing out on a national level. Many black South Africans feel betrayed by the failure of the ANC, riddled with corruption, to provide access to land for the black majority. The ANC has tried, half-heartedly, critics say, to redistribute some of it, but the party has failed repeatedly, angering black residents all the more. One ANC program purchased land from willing white farmers, but was so tainted by corruption that politicians ended up with more land than the ordinary citizens who were supposed to benefit. In recent years, an ANC spin-off, the Economic Freedom Fighters, has tapped into this anger by calling on black South Africans to take land on their own. Having lost some of his party's core supporters, President Cyril Ramaphosa, the ANC leader, is now also pushing to change the constitution to allow the expropriation of land without compensation. But eager to avoid international ire, Mr. Ramaphosa said during the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in January that his country would handle land reform in a manner that takes the interests of all into account. "We are not going to allow land grabs in South Africa," Mr. Ramaphosa said. Many are deeply skeptical of his promises, warning of the seizure of white-owned farms that turn Zimbabwe, South Africa's next-door neighbor, into an international pariah. President Trump waded into the dispute last year, echoing false or exaggerated allegations that white farmers were being forced off their land by the government and killed in large numbers. The president's statement was a boon for Afroforum, a far-right group that advocates for Afrikaners like Mr. Smit and enjoys popular support here in Stellenbosch. Contrary to the claims, the law has sided with Mr. Smit. A judge ordered the squatters to vacate the farm, but most of the shacks have remained while the decision is being appealed. Now, the municipality is negotiating with Mr. Smit to buy the plot. The case has reverberated far beyond Stellenbosch because of the town's singular place in South Africa's past, present and future. Long before the region became famous for its wines, Stellenbosch University, an elite institution that until recently taught mostly in Afrikaans, produced many of apartheid's leading politicians and thinkers, so much so that Stellenbosch is often called the cradle of apartheid.